nice meeting both of you.
You too.
Looking forward to this talk. Actually, we had a very short talk after your presentation on it's not about software anymore.
Ah, okay.
Right. And because first of all, the fact that it shifted away from software and more into disruption and innovation.
Well, actually, I think the shift is to stopping writing software and go back a step and say, what on earth are we writing software for?
Yes.
And just having written software because somebody tells you to write software isn't good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Writing software to accomplish something, knowing what it is that should be accomplished and making sure that it's accomplished is the job of anybody who wants to call themselves a software engineer. They can be a programmer if they want, and they can do what somebody else tells them, okay? But if you want to be an engineer, then you take a problem and you solve it. You don't do what somebody else tells you.
Indeed, yeah. Even how crazy the solution is.
Well, that's why I say it's not about software. Indeed. Yeah, you have to write software to solve the problem, but it's about solving the problem, whatever the problem is that you are trying and attempting to solve.
I know.
And we haven't gotten enough people into that mode in software, but I spent my first few years of programming in engineering departments, not software departments, where people who did stuff were responsible to make sure that it worked. So I wrote software for control systems in manufacturing plants, controlling great big roll goods equipment at 3M. And I did it in the engineering department, where I worked as a junior engineer with senior engineers that had been writing controlling big roll good processes for some decades. And they did it with wires and components, yes, but that's how it was done. And then the computers gradually replaced that. So I was writing some software, and they were the ones who gave me the fundamental belief that if you're an engineer and you're given a problem, you solve the problem. You don't do what people ask you or tell you to do. You say, oh, we're going to build a control system for this plant. So what does that mean? And how will we know it's working? And until it's actually making good product and maintainable by the plant engineer and working well for the operators, you haven't done your job. And there's not somebody in between saying you do this. Yes, there are senior engineers who understand safety issues and stuff like that. But basically, as a group, your job is to control that thing, the manufacturing process, so that it makes good product, so that it's easy to maintain by the plant engineer, so that the operators can use it well and not defeat it because they hate it. And that's your job. And you have to figure out what that means. You don't have somebody telling you what it means.
But the interesting thing is, if you have like this mindset that you want to figure out what it is and solve the problem, you can get in a lot of trouble. And I gotta give you an example, because we were approached. First of all, I probably need to explain who we are.
Sure.
When I was,
that's a good idea.
Yeah. So first of all, the we, it's when I was doing my PhD, it was in an interdisciplinary research group who's focused on collective intelligence.
Collecting what?
Collective intelligence.
Okay.
So there's a lot of theory on it, but there are also some engineers in there. So I was one of the engineers. But after the Arabic Spring, we actually got like a little bit of attention from the world to our research group.
Yeah.
Normally we only get like fellows from Santa Fe or MIT, or they find us in Brussels, but the rest of the world mostly doesn't know that we exist. But after the Arabic Spring, actually we had some interesting attraction, and there was this consortium of engineers from the Netherlands. Most of them were in large scale manufacturing, like dragger boats, and so big engineering project, building bridges and stuff like that. But they were going on a training mission to Dubai, to talk about food security.
About what?
Food security.
Okay.
Good
So,
idea. Good thing to have.
so that was 2012, right?
Okay.
And because we seen SARS, we seen the what was it again? The flu, the bird flu,
H1N1.
right? That's 2002, and then you have 2018. That's after it. You have the with animals you had the diseases, right? But now, of course, we have COVID. But the whole idea there is that it's a food security problem. But the engineers that went over to the province always went as separate parts. So you have the guys with the innovation in greenhouses. You have the guys with innovations in supply chain. So, but they would all be like separate, and like they decide like that's not a solution. They have they have a food security problem. We need to give them a total innovation solution. So we're going to build a city, well, medium-sized city to do the whole food chain from zero to the table. But we weren't really sure if that would even fly. So during a training mission, you actually have some space to explore opportunities in the outlines of the mission. And it was basically a mission about higher education. And that fitted well with my, I created a peer learning platform showing that you can scale the agile coach from 30 project to 300 project. That's a little thing I did to finish my PhD. But in that meeting, we actually want to use that to run the city, the food security. So it's called Food Metropolitan City. And the Chinese diplomats, they were like, yes, finally, yeah, we're gonna do that. We're gonna put the money on the table. We're gonna start doing that stuff. And but the people that were supporting the mission, they didn't know that we had this idea. So we suggested a solution. They wanted the solution.
Just a minute.
And then the people became very afraid.
Just one moment. Hold on. We have a delivery coming.
Food delivery.
Okay, it should be here any moment.
We have a grocery delivery coming.
Okay.
666 Carnelian Lane, Eden Prairie.
Oh, okay, Google, stop. Show me the driveway. Hey, Google, show me the driveway. Come on.
These assistants are so unsmart.
Okay. All right.
So
where were we?
Well, I was talking about sometimes as engineers, if you come up with a solution, you can get in quite some trouble because you suggest a solution that kind of destabilizes the power structures, and then you get in
Happens.
trouble. Yeah.
The problem there was that people were thinking as individuals from within a discipline rather than as a team pursuing a solution to a problem.
Well, in this case,
contains enough of the right people with a mix of skills and authorities and capabilities and insights, then the team should be able to make those choices.
That's exactly what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, but the team, that's the thing.
Collective intelligence beats any expert.
Yes, but the problem there is that when that starts moving, you actually also, as a team, you're not isolated either. So if you as a team start creating something, it needs to fit in a hierarchy, basically.
Right.
So the
problem context. That's the problem context.
Okay, so continue on. So what? I understand that teams exist within some sort of an environment. For example, one of the biggest problems all of Agile has had forever is that IT has a long-standing historical structure that's a cost center.
That's, sorry?
A cost center
Mm-hmm.
inside of a business. And that has a huge amount all the way vertically up to the top of political implications.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to go.
Yeah.
It can't stay. And that's been a massive problem with software development as opposed to a lot of other engineering innovations, is that there's in most sort of companies founded before 2000, at least industries that firmed up before 2000, it's almost impossible to get rid of this cost center mentality. And the cost center mentality is not solve a problem, it's, automate a process, do what you're told kind of concept. And it's true, it definitely impacts the power structure, but if the solution is going to blast through some existing, think about electric cars.
Mm-hmm.
Think about solar energy. All that's doing is killing the existing gasoline structure or the existing coal-fired plants structure, because we have this whole new innovation. This is pretty common across seriously new innovations in lots and lots of environments.
But I think that actually in the presentation you give about, it's not about software anymore. You already mentioned that the big challenge there is like the ability to adapt, to change, to pivot, right?
Right.
I think about the example you give with the air fighter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because all the things you're mentioning, like Kodak, they keep focused on what they were used to do. Well,
exactly.
If everything becomes complex adaptive, the idea that you have control is just an illusion, and you need to navigate instead of having control, right? So the question is then, how will your market look tomorrow? It's not the ones you did yesterday. I like the pizza company that shifts to creating screens, right? So, but that's showing at scale, showing the ability to switch.
So I have a new thing now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Everything is always and always has been complex adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
Mechanisms that we use to think about them have not always been. The mechanisms we use to make decisions about how to behave have not always been.
Mm-hmm.
But the systems themselves have always been complex, with interactions among things that we're aware of and things that we're not aware of. So it's not the situation, it's not the job, it's not the economy that has changed. It's how people think about and navigate within it,
Mm-hmm.
how they choose actions to make impacts that they're after.
Mm-hmm. I like to use this metaphor. In a droplet, you cannot create a whirlpool. And what big organizations try to do with the command and control is make sure that every small division isn't going to complex adaptive dynamics. So if it's all cells, they can keep control. That's typically how a military structure is trying to keep control at the top.
Actually,
that was true 200 years ago.
Indeed, yeah.
The military organizations that actually fight wars are way, way better at not doing command and control than most big companies.
Indeed, yeah, true.
They've learned that if you actually think that the general can tell everybody what to do and where to move and win, those are the kinds of armies that always lose. And that was discovered in the vicinity of about 200 years ago. Yep. And right now, military thinking is way, way into the how do you create within a very large structure the right amount of independence at the right level. They have a theory, most military theory goes on the understand the commander's intent 2 levels up.
Mhm.
Maintain situational awareness 1 level up. And by doing that, let me see what we're expecting a delivery here. So
Mhm.
shortly. Okay, so they should be driving in really soon. So I'll let you know when I see them. Then you can go get it.
Sure.
So I've got another thing that I'm thinking about right now. And that is the concept of diversity
Mhm.
is interesting. And the concept of complex adaptive systems is interesting and very important. But we can always take any concept and go too far with it.
Oh, sure.
So, Aristotle said that virtue is halfway between 2 extremes always. And no matter which way we have of thinking about things, if we take it to an extreme, I remember we visited a whole a company in Germany that was supposedly doing the whole
Holistic.
the kind of
Holacracy.
management, holistic
Holacracy.
Holacracy. Yeah.
and they took it way too far.
Typical.
And it was a very uncomfortable company in which all of the, because it went too far. So,
Yeah.
there's a curve that goes like this, and you have good until you get to a certain point, and then it kind of flattens out, and then too much of it goes down too far. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's complex adaptive systems or command and control, there is some place in between.
If they keep to the ideal, I mean it.
They're in the driveway now. Why don't you go get it?
So because I follow you what you say with the, I often see that large organizations have learned from the military how to do the hierarchy, but forgot about self-organizing teams. Well, if you see that the idea that
I don't think you can say large organizations and put them in a box like that.
No, sure.
There's way too many large organizations that are, in lots of spots along the curve. And I can think of some very large organizations that are very nimble and very small team orientated, and some that aren't. And it has a lot to do with the context that they're working in and the history that they're coming from.
And I guess that it will depend from the one to the other. I've actually been in too few to know a lot about large companies. They only started getting on my radar.
So be careful, because I've been in large companies. And large companies can do really good stuff, and they can really,
Sure.
That's where I learned how to be an engineer. I worked at 3M for 20 years, and all the time I was there, maybe not so much after I left because we got a new CEO. It was really, really a very innovative company, very much focused on local teams. That's where I learned that, let me give you a metaphor. When I was 7, I got my first camera. Okay, it was a film camera. It was a little brownie because it was, early 50s or something. And I was told, don't open it after you start the film until it's all wound up. Okay, but nobody told me why. So I remember very clearly, I opened it twice during the first 12 shots or so on the roll of film that I had. And I was done. I had all these great pictures. I sent it off to be developed, and it was mostly no good with 1 or 2 shots. And I learned why you weren't supposed to open it, okay? They could have told me, but they didn't. Now, if you don't tell me why I'm doing something, I'm not going to do it. I've kept all my life. And if you can imagine me in a big company, I'm that same 7-year-old. If you don't tell me why, I don't pay any attention. Yeah. If you give me a rational, good reason for behaving that way, okay. If you don't, I'm going to understand it myself.
I like that.
And it's that same attitude that I had at 3M, and I was encouraged. So, some companies force compliance to the way that they think, and there was a little bit of that at 3M, but a lot of them don't. And it also depends within any big company where you're at, which division and which branch. And, we once did a manager's training that was trying to get everybody to think, innovatively and differently. and encourage people to kind of think for themselves. And I realized in the exercise, it was a well done exercise, but we had to take an actual case study and make decisions. And then we'd follow the case study and say, well, here's what actually happened. And this case study followed the introduction of a brilliant new product. But at every case when the senior management in the division had to make a decision, it was like a decision between a very, carefully done, a careful, well-schooled tech director versus a kind of a young upstart that had lots of good ideas. Which one would you choose? And half would choose one and half would choose the other. And then we'd go down and we had to explain to our group why we wanted to choose this one. And then they would say, well, here's what actually happened. And it was always the stuff that I chose. And half of the people would choose the conservative approach, and the other half would choose the really much different approach. And by choosing the relatively sort of, I don't know, radical or something approach is where success came from. And that was the whole lesson. And I learned by all of the discussions that approximately half of the managers in the room that were going through this exercise would have taken a very different approach than me. And been very more careful about their decisions. And the other half wouldn't. So, and I observed that in the company. Half of the company was really very fun to work with, and the other half you didn't want to be in. And you had to be careful who you worked for, because, you could end up with one of these guys that expected you to do what they wanted. And then you could end up with one of these persons who would like you to figure things out for yourself. I had a guy that worked for me for a while, and for many times he kept coming in and asking me what I wanted him to do. And I finally said, don't you ever ask me that again. I hired you so you could think for yourself, for heaven's sake. I'm not going to tell you the answer.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's
and because I was hired at a manufacturing plant by a guy who said to me, so, if we never have anything to disagree about, then one of us is superfluous. And it's not me, he said.
That's
that was his way of saying, you had better disagree with me sometimes. Because if we always agree, then one of us doesn't need to be here.
Yeah, true. There you go. Yeah.
A very common saying at Toyota is that great conflict makes great cars.
Yeah, and if you
don't have
there's stuff
disagreement,
that needs to go in the fridge.
it's in.
Okay.
If you don't have disagreements and hashing out solutions that are better than the options that you were considering trading off, you end up with inferior results. And in fact, I'm reading a book right now by Roger Martin, which talks about making better decisions than what you get from a simple trade-off that's either or. Instead of arguing either or, you look much more deeply and understand the context of the whole situation and come up with ways of achieving the goals that you're after within the constraints represented by each of the polar opposites, which is similar to what Mary was saying about virtue being halfway between.
Yeah. And navigating with it.
The tools of design thinking contributing to this, and several others. I'm only into chapter 3, so I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet, but.
Well, maybe if I may, actually, this is a good point for me to tell a little bit about what I'm doing, because
I don't know why you're calling, so maybe we should get to that.
Okay, well, so maybe I should go back in the discussion we had after the presentation. I started getting into my own research, which basically is about making innovation a hard science. And so I'm more like an engineer from my work, the thing is that we had this. I had this. My very first advisor had an R&D facility doing .com, and when the .com collapsed, he actually became guest professor back at the artificial intelligence lab.
Okay.
But it was about taking design thinking to the next level, basically.
Taking what to the next level?
Design thinking
Okay.
to the next level. So, and they came up with what they called it a blue sky research facility. So we're talking about late 90s. They were doing augmented reality, virtual reality, quantum computing, nanotechnology, all in a private funded R&D facility. The thing is, so .com collapsed, all this thing collapsed. The guy becomes a guest professor for 2 years. And we did like these reflections on all those experiments. And it kind of set myself into motion to where I was going with my research. And we figured out, we were questioning, like, is there a way to take from a cybernetic perspective a look at creativity, looking at all those cases. So basically I started with a simple, it's called an artificial life simulation, but on a problem on creativity. So it was, the specific simulation was trying to simulate how an ape would get the idea to use a stone to open a nut, to open fruit. Okay. That was the basic idea. Out of it comes an answer, a system, a feedback system, but we had something like, yeah, well, is this anything relevant or not? But the strange thing is, because I mean, we were already in a pretty interdisciplinary setting, I noticed that the same feedback structure is popping up in different domains, and we didn't understand why. So the same feedback system is described by neurosurgeons who wonder how the different brain modules communicate with each other. It's called the global workspace hypothesis. But the same feedback model is also described in strategic management, where they are questioning, like, if we now, so we go from resources to capabilities. So, but now let's think about dynamic capability framework, that's TEAS and so on. They come to the same feedback mechanism. And I was really totally hooked when there's a guy called Bruno Latour. He's an anthropologist in science. So what he's looking at is how does science in action works. And in a book in 1999 called Pandora's Hope, he actually describes what he calls the science blood flow. So it's the feedback system, how science emerges out of the social fabric. And they all come to the same feedback system. So what the hell is this? So that's from a kind of research theory perspective, we were wondering, do we have a system of creation? And what the hell does that even mean? But there was like a huge gap between the theory, like that's like dissipative systems and so on, and how the hell as an engineer am I going to try it out? How am I going to be able to do experiments?
Okay.
So the way to do experiments was actually just as a digital anthropologist going into actual open source projects and see if I could see the mechanism again. And so that's in 2005, I was exploring like what in open source is moving at the moment. And there was this move going on content management systems.
Yep.
And so I looked at the many different content management systems, but there was like this one content management system that got me all my attention. It's called Drupal. And there was an interesting Drupal. So there was an interesting community culture. Like, why were these people knitting socks for their open source project? Why were they baking cakes with the logo? Why were they creating songs for the logo? They were doing crazy things that doesn't really seem related to the software development, right? So I start really getting into it. And for 5 years, I followed the ecosystem. So behind the open source project, there was a startup ecosystem, a business ecosystem. And it was extremely lively between 2005 and 2010. And it stopped in 2010 because the corporates kind of start seeing like, oh, this is interesting. We want to get a piece of the cake. And the whole culture kind of changed. So it was all from like this creative piece of strange thing. And then suddenly it was all about compliance. So, but it's just like the small village got overrun by all the outsiders, basically.
Interesting.
And it's because I actually interviewed all the startups. I had like a dozen of the founders. I talked to them. I tried to make a paper, but I never been able to publish the paper because the paper doesn't fit with the mindset in innovation management literature. The thing is that when I interviewed them with the question, why are they doing open innovation? Because I've seen it clearly in the ecosystem. I see them doing it, but why? What was there a reason? What was the reason that they were doing it? So when I interviewed all 12 of them, they first asked me like, what is open innovation? So they didn't know. So I explained them what open innovation is as a policy structure. And then they said like, that's a bad idea. We're not going to do that. And I said, yeah, no, wait a minute, it's happening. Why is it happening? And then they said like, well, yeah, we don't want that. Why is it happening? So when they start digging into it, it was all about the way they were creating their teams. So they had like this, what is called talented developers, but there's like this terrible idea that the talent in this ecosystem are young people. It's not. The talent in the ecosystems are old, stubborn, single males, basically. Not only males, there are also females. I mean, but
yeah, I could be an old, stubborn, single.
Yeah, female. There you go. I mean, you would fit
I would
perfect.
Fit real well.
Yes, exactly. I think everything I heard so far, you would fit perfect as a description of what is the talent.
Probably even more stubborn than tongue.
I guess, yeah.
Okay, so continue.
I'll never admit that.
Continue on.
Okay, so the talent is like wood. They are like the very stubborn people, but that allows them to create roots in a open source project. They know how to go deep and create fundamentally new kind of structures there. But of course, you can never sell a person like that on itself. So the way that the entrepreneurs were working with it is they create a whole like safety environment around the talent to actually make a competitive advantage they could actually sell, basically. And the thing is, of course, I mean, like if the guy is like in multilingual, that's what their company had to be about. If the guy is in scalability, then it's about scalability. But they wouldn't have all the talent. So what happens if they have a client, they would, of course, focus on the thing they know best, like multilingual or scalability or whatever. But of course, there would be other parts that the client needs, and they wouldn't have the talent in-house. So what they did is they watched the open source, all the repository, the Git information is online available. So they actually watched like who is the main developer of a module. And of course, if it's a talent, he's probably in one of the other companies. So then they figure out like who is the company he's working for. And that's how the entrepreneurs collaborated. It was pure, very straightforward. And I actually created a presentation on it because it fits perfect with what we know from ecosystem dynamics. I've called it How Digital Wolves Change Digital Rivers. And it's a reference to something they actually had in Yellowstone, where wolves change rivers. So the thing is that because the wolf as an element in the ecosystem, you actually have a very strange cascading effect that allows the bushes to flourish. And if the bushes flourish, the rivers will stabilize. And if that stabilizes, everything becomes richer, basically. So I kind of describe this wolves and this hunting in packs as the entrepreneurs. They were doing that. So they were hunting for a client, but well, actually the problem the client has, not the client. They didn't eat the client, right? They eat the problem the client has. But they were doing that as a hunting pack. And of course, when the big corporates came in, that's not the way a big corporate works. A big corporate kind of gives a total solution. They have a framework, and they try to push everything that was happening in this anarchistic way of working into frameworks. And you got tribes in a framework, but it's like it's not working at all. I've seen implementations of frameworks like that in the few because after 2010 the thing collapsed. So the most innovative of the startups left. They just sold everything to the other company, and then they went out. So
right. They had better things to do with their time.
Yeah, they just followed where creation was pulling them, because they realized, like, okay, we finished with what we've created a church over here, right? So now we're going to create a church over there. It's basically they moved away.
I do that. I've done that.
Yeah. So, but it's
I get it.
So what I actually described that in that one paper, because what I've realized is that the entrepreneurs, they were like a dissipative system. So there was like a lot of dissipation at the bottom, a lot of energy, but there were two policies playing that created the structure of the dissipative system. So one is called community contribution. It's pretty common in open source, right? And that just creates the dispersion of all the development. Right. But the one that created the structure on the meta level was called community first. And that's I didn't know until I did the interview that was happening. So the way the entrepreneurs were looking at the ecosystem they lived in, they looked at it as a fragile thing, as a baby. It was their baby, and they would do everything for their baby. And their mentality was like this. They say, like, okay, I'm an entrepreneur. I can always start a new company. But if I kill the ecosystem, I cannot be in that ecosystem anymore. So I will prefer doing bad to my company than bad to the ecosystem. And that was a consistent thing, a culture element that all the entrepreneurs were sharing. They weren't talking with each other about it. So it was just something they felt logical. The way
what does it mean to preserve the ecosystem rather than my company? What kind of actions did that generate?
Okay, I'll give you some concrete examples. I mean, if you want to read about them, I've interviewed them all, and I can send you my PhD about it. But I'll give you
this stuff to read.
Yeah, I'll give you one. They noticed that there was a lot more requests for creating websites with the system, right? So many that they couldn't serve. So instead of them trying to serve the clients that were with way too much, they start training other companies to serve the clients. So they shifted from being software, the website providers, to the certification training structure for all the other companies. And of course, those companies that actually really wanted to scale and become really, really big, they had something like, no, stop. We could become the big ones. While the more entrepreneurial were saying, that's not going to go fast enough. We need to move fast. And if we want to move fast, then we can't be the big company. We're going to just create an army of companies here. And that's stuff that happened. So suddenly they start creating podcasts about how to do the implementation and all that kind of stuff. And the companies who did that, like, shifted with them, with the system. So is that clear? Or, oh, did I? Bad quality? I think we had a hiccup.
Internet. Yeah. Okay. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. So 3M always has made roll good stuff that's what we called soft goods, consumables. They never made any hardware, at least not very successfully, but they were really good at making stuff that got consumed. So there is a graphics division that wanted to create massive graphics for billboards.
Okay.
And they created a really good film to put on billboards. Instead of having people having to go up there and paint, if you could print on this film and just put it up there, that'd be great, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was no printer capable of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So they invented and built a printer capable of doing that. And then they said, but hey, we're no good at printers. So they sold and encouraged and started up a whole bunch of companies and said, here, we'll give you, all the rights to make this printer, make a bunch of them so we can sell the film.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to be a big company that sells printers. We want to sell this film and do what we're good at. And we want you guys to take this hardware, take it off of our hands, make a great success out of it, build yourself a business. And so they started up a bunch of companies and licensed it to even other big companies so that they did not have to do the printer. Mm. And the graphics division was extraordinarily successful because of this strategy. It's the same concept.
It's the same concept, yeah. So the thing I'm trying to understand is the system dynamics behind it. So the hidden system dynamics that allow that.
I think at least behind that particular era, that particular decision, was the concept of what are we good at and what we don't want to spend our time trying to be good at. Mm-hmm. And if we don't care to spend our time trying to be good at it, then, and it's part of our ecosystem that we need, then we have to create something to put that into the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's that recognizing that you serve a point in an ecosystem, not the whole ecosystem. And I think it's a look at a bigger view a customer-focused view of what you're trying to accomplish, not a company-focused view.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we all behave like that as individuals.
Yeah.
We all have certain skills that we're good at and that we develop and get better at, and some things that we could get good at, but it's not worth our time. It's better off having other people either in our organization or hired in our community to do certain things. It's a specialization. Mm-hmm. We all use that trade-off in all parts of our lives.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is it's pretty well described by what I mentioned earlier, the science blood flow.
The what? Say that again.
So it's called science blood flow, and it's a concept by Bruno Latour.
I don't understand what you said. Something block flow?
Blood flow. Your heart beating, blood flow.
Blood flow.
The flow of your blood.
Oh, blood flow.
Blood. Sorry if I'm. You're like your heart pumping, right?
Yeah.
The flow of your blood.
Okay, what was the first word before what? Signs?
So science, blood flow. So what is the beating heart that creates science and technology?
Oh, science blood flow.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. I
So,
just didn't understand your English. Sorry. It's not just your English. It's the fact that it's through an internet connection now. So science blood flow.
So
that's an interesting label. I don't visualize what we were talking about and that label as I don't see how it fits.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy system dynamic, but the 3 out of the 4 dimensions you need, you already mentioned. You have like there's something in the world, there's something you're good at, and then you have like your driver that's navigating between those 2 tensions, right? So that's one part. And then the 4th dimension is that you need to evolve it. And that's more like having a swing, like you
Yep.
push a little bit more to the top, but then you really need to go all the way back to get another go at it, right? To
Yeah, I've seen
accelerate the
that for
swing.
decades. Yep.
Yeah. So, but if you combine all those dynamics together, you start capable of creating something where there wasn't anything, and that same structure reappears all the time in the different domains. Like in my own domain on artificial intelligence, in the domain on studies on the brain, in understanding how science emerges in the world.
So this pendulum thing, tell me more about that.
Well, it's even easier to understand if you look at sailing against the wind, because that's even stronger than the pendulum. If you know a bit about sailing against the wind, you have two kind of forces.
I actually sailed a boat when I was a kid.
There you go.
So I do get it.
Yeah. So you got drag and you got lift, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at those two forces, they don't get you against the wind. In the most optimal, if you have like 100% draft and lift and no draft, you would be like 90 degrees against the wind, but you wouldn't go inside.
No, you have to be just a little bit off.
So what is happening is the way the boat is inside the water, it creates like a tension with the viscosity of the water.
That's a nice analogy.
Yeah.
That's nice.
So the big lift becomes a little bit smaller, but it goes inside the right direction, and that's like the cost of conservation. So if that my whole PhD starts with that, like there's always a cost for conservation. And the system of creation also has this cost of conservation. And it's you need to navigate with tension to actually get out of your head, because everything you can imagine, that's not enough. It's everything you can imagine, and then you can put in action. And if you put it into action, then it screws up everything you thought. And
Exactly.
in that screwing up, there's the novelty. There's the fundamentally new. And following that novelty is a swing kind of movement, because I mean, I like what happened during the Manhattan Project. It's like the underdog solution that became the solution. They were focused on creating explosion, but then they figured out that on that atomic scale, trying to create those explosions, it melts everything. It doesn't work. So they really had to shift their whole mindset to work with an implosion. So, and if you then see the Trinity bomb, it's like it's a ball. But the idea that you could actually change waves that go like this, so waves like this, and then you have to like turn them upside down so that they would become good for an implosion. When they started the project, they thought it would never be possible. And they had to include people from very different domains like optics. They were the elementary physicians weren't considering people from optics. And that story comes over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But it's about that navigating with tension, that the actions will tell you where you can go, and then you need to follow the moving target. That's the process, and then it becomes like sailing against the wind. So
I like a metaphor, sailing against wind. I like that.
The whole discussion takes me back to the 1960s. I was doing my senior year as a physics student in Madison, Wisconsin. And I took maybe it was early 70s, I took a course in history of science. And at that time, the go-to book was from Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Okay.
And the importance of the standard way of thinking, the standard mental models that a scientific discipline adhered to and did all of its work and thinking and judgments within, and how it was necessary in order to introduce a new paradigm, that's where the word paradigm became popular. A new paradigm, it was almost impossible.
By the way, if you
Because-
haven't read that book, you should.
Have you read it?
Long ago, very
Okay.
long ago. So
But-
it's
It's almost impossible to introduce a new paradigm because all of the people who are authorities and practitioners in the field buy into the old paradigm, the old way of thinking, the old way of recognizing what's important and what is noise.
I know, yeah, I know.
People that pay attention to the noise are rejected. They can't get a grip. How do they do it? They outlive the people whose entire life is embedded in the old paradigm.
That's kind of funny.
And the same thing is happened in our overall economic perspective. We have adapted for the world of management the model of our economy and of our companies as machines, which have parts. And parts can be optimized. And if you optimize all the parts, if you manage it to make each part work as well as it can, then you will have the best overall outcome. And that model points to productivity as a metric of goodness for the performance of an organization, for the performance of a culture, of an economy. And that is really the most profound mistake that's been made over the last 200 years. There are small domains in which it works well. As a physicist, I'm used to thinking with models. The Aristotelian physics model is what most of us use for most of our day-to-day lives in expecting what's going to happen when we do this or that. Newtonian model applies to more cases. And for most engineering and scientific activity, the Newtonian model is very effective until you get too small or too fast or too far away.
Too far away.
Then
Satellites.
you need quantum mechanics or relativity in one flavor or another. Until you get too small, too fast, too high energy, in which case you need quantum chromodynamics or some other thing that we're still trying to discover. So it's all about models telling you what to pay attention to, what's important, and cause and effect. That if you do this, then you expect that to happen. And if this metric is going the way you think it should, then you're successful. So I think that is kind of the foundation. It all goes back to Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolutions and the role of paradigms in how we choose and decide. And again, the book I'm reading from Roger Martin is the second one. The first one is when, that I finished was when, what is it? When less is more. And he's basically saying that
We're trying to be too efficient.
we're focusing so much on efficiency that in all domains, not just engineering, not just software, but in all domains of our political, economic, social society, that we are destroying the potential and in danger of collapsing.
Well, I mean, I've seen 3 times a kind of digital collapse. It's been an important part of my empiric research. And I'm actually now in the process of writing a book called The Interversity. It was the conclusion of my PhD. But now with the second lockdown, I really get the feeling that it may be time to bring it out. And it is actually going into this problem that universities are a bit like libraries. What a library is for information, a university is for R&D. But the thing is that the world has changed. Everything becomes more complex, needs faster reactions. We've been making things fluid that were fixed before. So you could have like a generation going over a problem in universities, but like if you look now, more and more we're getting confronted with complex challenges. And universities are not designed for complex challenges. University comes from universitas, so it's about all the knowledge. And
Well,
just
when I first started writing about, well, I wrote all my life, but started writing about software 20 years ago. And ever since, I have been criticized, but especially at the beginning, that I didn't use any kind of research, and that it wasn't valid. And there were plenty of places where I couldn't submit or publish because I wasn't doing it according to the right rules.
Yeah.
But I felt that the stuff that I was writing about was moving way faster than the new thinking in the software world was going on in universities, because they didn't actually spend time writing code, and they didn't spend time dealing with the next hardware generation that came along.
Exactly.
And they didn't spend time with the very rapid movement in the technology, the software technology area. So I didn't believe that there was a possibility for research to be a valid basis for my stuff. And I was writing for people who weren't going to worry about what the research said. They were going to worry about what it took, you know, to do something way better than what they were doing before. And so I saw that research is obsolete 20 years ago in
exactly,
for sure, in software. Absolutely.
Yeah. And but it's becoming a problem at the moment because
you just need a generation to retire, and then you'll be fine.
Oh no! It's
according to Thomas Kuhn, anyway.
Then you'll have a new problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We'll never run out of problems as long as we do stuff. So
yeah, and you become the problem after a while too. You know.
That's interesting. Huh? That's interesting. I like to make the separation between conservative research, and that's what's happening in universities, and creative research. And that's what's happening in an entrepreneurial space.
Okay.
The Manhattan Project is an entrepreneurial space. The Apollo Project is an entrepreneurial space. And there's been more, those are, and many organizations are where creative research is happening.
Okay, so if you go back to 2000, right around the year 2000, okay? The concept that you could have valid, viable, distributed databases, distributed systems did not exist. Everybody knew that you had to have, you've heard of the CAP theorem, consistency, availability, and partitioning. You can't have all three.
Okay.
And since you had to have consistency and availability, you couldn't partition. So all big companies had like central databases, and it was all central. But when people moved onto the internet, especially when Google moved onto the internet and Amazon moved onto the internet, one thing didn't work anymore. So they had to invent something new. And simultaneously, from the years about 2000 or 99 to about 2004, Google came up with two of their really good researchers. What the heck, his name? Gemwat and anyway, they kind of invented how do we deal with storing and searching in a vastly distributed environment. And what they also discovered was a single physical computer would always die. So they divided anything into little tiny bits, scattered it 3 times across 3 pieces of hardware, all of which could die, and then managed all of this and regenerated everything in software. And that's how the internet works. And that became the basis for open source software like Hadoop and stuff like that. And they invented a way, which is very, very different than anything before, of doing massive storage in a vastly distributed environment. At the same time, Amazon was inventing a way for a very large, they had single large computer, and that didn't work. because they wanted to get too big. And they had a very large company, and their hierarchical structure, there wasn't enough communicate. People didn't talk to each other. And Bezos said, no, you know what? We can't have to talk to each other. Communication cannot be the thing that keeps us together because we can't talk that much. So we have to find a way to let small groups do things without talking to everybody else.
Yep.
And if you look at AWS and the small teams that make it up, they're founded on the principle that you don't have to communicate to all the other teams. You have to have hardened service boundaries with rules, and then you communicate by through those boundaries, but you cannot have to talk to all the teams every time. You can't have to wait for 50 teams to change something all at the same time. You have to allow every single team to make changes to their software independently. And that was like, nobody thought that concept was ever possible. And it wasn't until they got to the idea of eventual consistency. You don't actually have to be consistent right now. You can fix it if you make a mistake now and again. And
but that fits perfect with Stigmergy, right?
Because it had to be massively big. So at the tripping point was going from very big companies to massive internet scale. And none of the rules that held for big companies held for moving to massive internet scale. And one of the reasons why companies have to go to the cloud is because all companies with their own data centers reached the limit of what they could do with the old paradigm. And they had to go to something that could live in the new paradigm. And it's way too expensive to recreate something that took big, very smart companies about 5 to 8 years to invent. And it's almost impossible to duplicate. So that thinking of when people talk about very large systems and they talk about big corporate systems, I laugh because those are small.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And we know how to do very large systems, and it ain't any of these frameworks that you guys think. It's nothing like that at all. It has nothing to do with it. It has to do with coming up with a completely new paradigm of how you store stuff and how you structure teams for communication. And that was done out of entrepreneurial necessity when those two companies were young and people didn't think they would survive. It was in that stage that they made most of their really, really aggressive changes. And the concepts came simply because they had ideas that the current paradigm could not accommodate.
And then they start mobilizing, right? There's a huge amount of, just like the swing, you always need to be in the world. You need to act in the world and grow it in the world. And when it starts growing, it starts getting its own life. And
so I believe that the swing in my world happens every 10 years.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and to me, that's a management generation.
Oh, now you're triggering something, because I actually have a presentation, and it happened right before we actually got all that funding for the Global Brain Institute. But it's a vision of how, like, I see the digital evolution as like waves on a beach that
every 10 years.
Every 10 years, but there's also like a bigger ebb and flood happening. And we know the concept of technological singularity. That's like 2 waves ahead. And I've been, in my research, I've been wondering, like, what are these waves? And
I believe that even if I look at it, all the big changes, all the changes where things become obsolete that used to be the latest, takes about 10 years.
Yes.
And so if you take a look at Agile by 2010, we had continuous delivery, which pretty much wiped out all of the stuff about iterations. Now, people didn't believe that, they still don't, but continuing on doing iterations after about 2013 was basically you were out of sync. In 2020, what we have is a whole new wave. And I think the wave is going to have something to do with, I'm not quite sure yet, but I think it is going to have to do with rethinking the concept of um, how do you decide what you should be doing?
Well, I actually see some stuff there because based on the anthropological work I'm doing.
Yeah.
Like I said, in the late 90s, there was part of a .com, and then it was still in a certain kind of fracture. But every now and then you actually see also the spirit changing. So if I look at the spirit of the developers in that entrepreneurial space during the .com, it's very different than 10 years later when I saw the spirit in the Drupal ecosystem. And it's very different than the spirit I'm at this very moment much into, which is called, at the moment there's an online community for Sociocracy 3.0.
What is that?
It's basically like Holacracy as a principle, but then it's a Creative Commons version. So it's way more entered on the open source philosophy. But it's but the thing is, it's not programmers anymore. It's communities of coaches. So they aren't coding software; they are coding people. And what they are coding in people is maturity. Things like exactly what you just said before, like you need to come up with a problem. You need to, other things they are learning is navigation with tension. One thing I really am impressed of is about standing in your vulnerability. That's a crazy one. To see that at massive scale, people going to stand in their own vulnerability, that's impressive. And it's happening at the scale as I saw it during the Drupal community.
So what I hear, standing in your own vulnerability, but what does that mean?
Well, I can show you. Well, I cannot show you a concrete example because it's pretty personal. But it's like someone who is telling how he's doing. He's trying to. So all of them are coaches. So it's not programmers; it's coaches. So and they're telling things that they are doing at the clients to help the client adopt to a new way of working, right? And then they actually go and stand and really express how they believe they have failed in doing that. And sharing that in such a way, I'm impressed that people are doing that. For me, it resonates a lot with what I saw a bit more than 10 years ago when people were baking. So you had the logo of the project, of the open source project, and the logo was popping up everywhere in the social life. So there were people baking cakes with it. There are people making songs about it. There were people creating all kind of crazy things with it. And I see the same thing happening now, but then related to maturity. How do you become as a person and as an organization? How are you going to become more mature? So stop complaining, stop seeing the problem as something outside, figure out how you can be the change, figure out how the problem is inside of you and not out there. And they are like in this, there's a crazy thing happening, but it's interesting to watch what is happening in the spirits. And then
okay,
now,
so let me
okay.
just stop for a minute. And you're seeing this in coaches where they're talking about vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you back up to my perspective,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think coaches is a good idea. I lived up until early 2000s in a world where there were no coaches that worked very well. And there were people who did the same thing, but they weren't coaches, they were managers, but they were what I'm going to call good managers. Their job was basically to teach people how to solve problems, to help people reach their full potential, to make sure that the people that they were responsible for grew and became as best as they could be. And that philosophy, you're in Belgium, right?
I'm in Belgium, yes.
Yeah, okay. It's a very Scandinavian kind of philosophy, where managers were never bad, okay, because this was their job. And by the way, in Minnesota here, we have a very strong Scandinavian heritage from about 100 years ago. And so 3M had that. Anyway, so I'm waiting for the day when coaches realize they shouldn't be there. That the concept of coach is not the right concept. And they need to find another job. That's my opinion, because I've never liked the idea of you tell people what to do, but you have no responsibility for results.
You spoke earlier admiringly.
That's what a coach is.
About entrepreneurs. And many of the things that the entrepreneur will do will be like coaching. But there's an essential difference between coaches and entrepreneurs.
Sure.
And that essential difference is responsibility. They commit themselves to be responsible for realizing their vision, for shaping it, making it come to fruition, making it real. And I think that is the critical element for all of this. Any scheme that does not center around responsibility for something is a waste. If you look at SpaceX, people there are responsible engineers, responsible for a rocket, responsible for a stage, responsible for fuel, responsible for engines, responsible for legs, responsible for some system or subsystem that is required to achieve the result, which ultimately is Mars. But in the short term, it's the next launch.
Yeah, well, that's...
And I think that any attempt to divorce the actual doing of the work from the responsibility for the results of the work, separate design from implementation, deciding what to do from the doing of it, is going to end up bad.
Yeah, and then, you actually touched on so many things. I don't even know how to start there, because if we talked about like these waves every 10 years. I can see things happening at this very moment that's meant with the best intention ever, from being responsible engineers, but they have no clue that they are putting us on the road to hell. And the reason I'm saying that...
Wait a minute.
Is because... Well, wait a minute, let me
go
first...
back. I don't understand what you just said. Please explain it more.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Well, that I agree with, but go back one more. What did you say about responsible engineers?
So I'm seeing a lot of responsible engineers doing things they believe that really will help, well, at least their company or even sometimes humankind, right? And not knowing that in the process, they are actually destroying it all the way. But not knowing it, because the problem, the thing I've discovered...
That's the issue. If you take, let's go back to the Tesla and SpaceX. If I'm responsible for a very small piece of the next rocket, I have to know exactly how that fits into the success of the next launch. Because if my little piece does anything in any way that makes the booster crash rather than land safely on the whatever, it's my responsibility and my job to understand my piece in the whole system.
Yeah.
So as a responsible engineer, I'm not just responsible for this little piece. I am also responsible for understanding how my little piece fits in the big thing that we are all as a group trying to accomplish, and making sure that I do my piece for that. I don't optimize my piece. I make sure that my piece works with the whole system to accomplish this major goal that we're heading for. And that is my definition of a responsible engineer, which is exactly the opposite of what you were just defining as responsibility.
I don't know. I mean, I'm looking specifically at Elon Musk himself, and he, as a responsible engineer, he tries to help humankind. That's what you hear him saying. He wants to work on making us a multi-planet species, and he, like with the AI project, he wants to make us compatible with artificial intelligence. But the problem is it's built on outdated worldview, because if you start understanding all those complex dynamic interactions, you start realizing that we are the artificial intelligence. We are not creating it, we are it.
Right.
And the thing, if you start looking at the system dynamics of why things are created, for example, if you look at school systems, why did public schooling got invented in society? Basically, because the elites already was educating their kids. They didn't need a schooling system. The schooling system was created to create a labor force that could work the machines. But now we are making the machines understand how to make and work the machines. So you start getting more and more a problem with, you don't actually need public schooling anymore. So there are many other dynamics at the space of collapse at the moment. So one of the things you see is that there's a war on sense making, basically because of many of the cascading dynamics. It's called tropic cascade. In an ecosystem dynamic that they talk about trophy cascade. Trophy cascade, yeah. So it's once you put something new on top, everything below can actually implode or change. And that's, I mean, I've seen it in everything you just mentioned, like the paradigm shift, right? So you, at a certain moment, you reach the end of what is capable, and then you need to shift in the new way of thinking.
Correct.
So how does that apply to bigger challenges?
I think the risk comes from scale.
Yeah, sure.
The rhythm comes from exhaustion of the potential of a generation of leadership. Mary said, of course, this rhythm, 10-year rhythm, came from the generation of management, but I don't think it's management. I think it is leadership. That a leadership group emerges across organizations, perhaps, across disciplines, perhaps, who have a particular way of thinking about things that steers the direction of the way things go. And in about 10 years, it proves to be inadequate.
Yeah.
And it's time for a new generation to take over.
If they still can.
Yes, and that's where the scale risk comes in. If you have Facebook or Twitter, we've just seen what happens when the scale of a vision of leaders, or so-called leaders, has too much impact.
But there's an even other dynamic at play. We are cultivating cognition. At the moment,
Cultivating what? I didn't hear that.
Cultivating cognition.
Cognition.
Yes. So the tech we are at this moment cultivating is about cognition. We had
what's true and how things work. What is true and how things work.
When you look at social media, for example, the media used to be there to give kind of a structure.
Yeah.
But now media has become a complex adaptive system, far from equilibrium. And what happens far from equilibrium, you get self-organization. So you got all these bubbles happening, but it's not just the bubbles. What you see is that the thing that used to be fixed, your mental health, is getting fluid. People, there's just so much stuff happening around you. I mean, your hormone levels now are getting regulated by technology. That's crazy. What I'm looking at is that if you look at evolution and you see cave-dwelling creatures, right? If creatures live generations in a cave, they will lose their sight. What I see with young kids today that are actually not just a little bit addicted to social media, but have offloaded many of their cognitive abilities to their technology, they become like cognitively lazy. Like one of the classical things you see at social media is that they just read like the first the headline, and then they start already having an opinion on it. They don't even start reading the abstract anymore. It's even worse than that. I mean, I know.
Okay, but be careful with generalizations.
Well,
because
it's the thing is that I've seen fellow friends, right, creating a critical point, and not just critical, just having an authentic point. And because they create an authentic point, they can already get stigmatized. I'm going to give a very concrete example of a good friend of mine. He's called Michel Bouwens. He's pretty well known for the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and for his work on the commons. At a certain moment, he actually looked at the work of Jordan Peterson, and he actually just created a blog about how he looked from a critical point to him. But the fact that he just used the word Jordan Peterson in his talk, he got attacked by a large portion of his community, because his community is strongly rooted in the left. And if you're strongly rooted in the left, you cannot use the word or even mention Jordan Peterson in a positive way. If you do that, you get burned. And it's pure. It's the same kind of conditioning that we saw with mass media, but that's now been happening with social media. But it's been happening in a distributed way where there's no one in control anymore.
It's always been that way.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to Thomas Kuhn, he traces that back centuries.
Sure, but the scale, that's the thing. That's what I started with. I said, like, you cannot have a whirlpool in a droplet. The scale has changed. And the scale we are playing with now is the one that is capable of making an individual person insane.
Okay, but the scale has been changing every, say, 10 or 20 years for my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like I was born before there was television.
Sure.
And television was just going to change everything, because now people who are politicians could come into homes and actually talk. And you didn't have to get your news from being able to get, say, radio or newsprint. And it was dramatic, and it was going to change everything. And then after television, we had another layer of way better communication with telephones. You could actually pick up the phone and call anybody in the country, like right away. And that happened more in the 60s and in the 70s. And then all of a sudden we had like way cheaper airplane travel. People could get on planes and they could go, like, without even thinking about it, they could go across the country and much faster. And then we started having this thing called internet, where we had these, and if you go to ARPANET, we had bulletin boards where people could start communicating, and the community was small enough that they could self-discipline for blasting people, but it was still a pretty rough community. And then it moved into the internet, and then it moved into social media. This isn't new. This has been going on for a long time, and it's not going to stop.
No, it's not.
And if we can't figure out how to take the explosion and make it work well for us rather than badly for us, then we're going to fail. If we can't fight it, we can't fight the fact that all kids are going to have mobile phones. You know, when my granddaughter, who is now a researcher in motivation area at University of Rochester at a graduate school, when she first picked up a cell phone at 12, her mother didn't want her to have it. No screens. And my son said, no, it's going to ruin them. And I said, no, I'm sorry. She's 12. She ought to have one. And I gave her a phone. We still pay for our granddaughter's phones. And they made really good use of it, even though they did massive amounts of texting to each other. When on my phone, on my plan, I could see they would do 1,000 texts a month sometimes, all the time. And yet,
by the way,
very smart, capable, competent. It didn't mess their minds up any more than TV messed my mind up.
well, yes, but I actually got 2 kids. I got one of 7 and 8, by the way.
Stop. Hey, Google, stop.
I got a kid I got a boy who is coming 8 now, and a girl who is 7.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting change even in primary school at the moment. You have those people who learn their kids how to surf the new wave, and you have those who use the technology as kind of babysitters, right? And
yes,
what is happening, because I'm actually talking to directors of secondary schools to help them with the problem. They now are in this bifurcation state with their kids, where you used to have like 1% autodidacts, and you have like a norm. There's no norm anymore. The norm has shifted away to like 60-70% of them aren't reaching the cognitive levels they saw 10 years ago, right? While there's like 20% of them who like jumps over there like crazy. But it's not that they jumped over it. It's not that they're along.
No, because this tool can expand your mind just as well as it can mess
exactly.
it up.
That's exactly.
And every tool is going to be like that. And eventually people learn how to use every media that comes along and expands things.
No, wait,
properly.
there I need to stop you, because we actually knew that in the late 90s. I can show you the experiments we did in the R&D facility, and there were like many of those experiments happening. And the experiments on ambiguous computing that actually were creating cognitive augmentation, they all disappeared. While the technologies that were creating mass control have all become big companies. So what is that? There's another dynamic aspect that I'm going to tell you about one crazy, and I'm so sad it never happened. It's called Today's Story. It was a great project. So what they did is they gave kids between 4 and 8 years, they gave them like a webcam, and like on the top of their chest, there was a button. And they just said like, if there's anything during the day that you think is interesting, push the button, right? So what happened was all kind of technical challenges, but they were capable of capturing the interesting parts the kid had that day. And then they combined it and they gave it to the parents. So the parents in the evening would, instead of being on social media watching like a celebrity with 3,000 followers, no, they would actually be able to watch the movie of their own kids.
I wouldn't want to do that.
Well, how
boring is that? They gotta live their own damn life.
Sounds like Snapchat or Instagram.
But wait a minute. Let me.
But your theory that you saw some good stuff that didn't take root, and you're trying to give me this as an example of good stuff, and I'm thinking that's an example of something that's cool. Well, I think it's. I haven't explained
I haven't explained what's good at it. You haven't. The thing that
I have never bought this concept that as technology advances, the current generation of kids is going to be hosed, because I have heard that for years and years and
that's
years
not what I'm
and
saying.
years and years, and it's never happened.
I mean,
okay,
look,
and it's not going to happen to this generation either. There are some kids that are going to be hosed, and there are also some kids that are going to use it well, and you can't stop it. So you need kids to learn how to use it well, because it isn't going to get stopped. And so if there are problems with TV, you learn how to fix it. If there are problems with internet, you learn how to fix it. If there are problems with social media, you learn how to fix it. And you learn how to teach your kids how to think.
That's not, sorry, but I can give you many examples where I'm really from the field, can show that that's not happening. And the thing that I wanted to tell about what was interesting in the experiment was not so much that by the evening the parents could have that story, but they used, because the thing is that they gave it to him, but it was like image without sound. So they went back to the kids and they asked the kids to think about those events that happened. And what was really interesting in that experiment is that the kids were capable of reflecting at a much more adult level than we were used to with kids of 4 and 8 years. So there was this psychological thing happening that we didn't expect. So there was a spillover effect of the experiment. Right? So
but I still don't understand what the experiment was supposed to show.
Well, basically, they were exploring in any possible direction what you could do with mobile devices. They had no clue what you could do with the mobile devices in the 90s, right? So they were experimenting, like, okay, I've got a mobile device, what am I going to do with it? Oh, you know what? Let's make our own movies of it. Yeah, let's try that. So it was just random experiments, basically. But one of the things we learned out of that is that your maturity, your ability of being mature, could actually be affected by technology. And you talked about leaders before. If I go back to communication, and you see how communication has actually forced leaders to stop doing wars like they were doing a century ago. You see that all the time they are forced to become more mature because the tools they are playing with are more destructive.
That's a hard sell for me in my country right now.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I'm trying to point at to you, because that's happening because we already moved too far with the paradigm. The paradigm already has.
It's going to also get fixed. It's going to also get fixed, hopefully without a war this time.
Well, I don't know. I'm
a child of a wartime environment. All right.
Yeah,
I grew up. I was born at the end of the Second World War, and the entire generation of my parents and my teachers lived through that war and lived through the Depression in their childhood, and we've had other wars since, but we have never stopped the advance of technology. But I have seen wave upon wave of everybody concerned that this newest technology, you name it, is going to ruin our next generation, and it never has.
No,
and I'm not going to ever buy the next generation of technology is going to ruin the next generation of kids.
I don't know why
we're too smart for that. Yeah, we will fix it.
I don't know why you're focusing on that, because that's not at all what I'm pointing at.
Okay, well, that was what I heard.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm trying to point at. What I'm trying to point out is that there's kind of a bifurcation happening.
There's kind of a what happening?
It's called bifurcation. So it's a split. So there's not a straight line forward, and it's very normal.
Well, that's true. I mean, but how is that different than history?
But it's not different than history. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not different from history. Like, I mean, just look at what is the main cause of the Second World War, the way the leaders decide how to finish the first one. Very easy, right? The problem was the leaders finishing the First World War didn't reach the level of maturity required to have a stable global organization. And that's exactly what's happening today. That's exactly what's happening today. The fact that you have all this kind of polarization is because our leaders today are self-authoring, and it's not enough. You cannot, a self-authoring person knows how to deal with a complicated
we need a new generation.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to tell you is that at this very moment, I see online communities of people who are trying to facilitate that change. And for me, it's not so different to what I saw 10 years ago and the 10 years before that. But the thing is that what is being coded is very different.
What did you say? The thing is, what is different?
What is being coded, what's being programmed is very different.
Okay.
So, but for me, it fits with. I like the.
Stop.
Okay. Sorry, Tom.
I want to hear what you have to say.
I
Yes.
think there's a dimension that hasn't come up here in this whole discussion,
Okay.
and that has to do with monkeys
Okay.
and the work of Robin Dunbar. Are you familiar with his stuff?
Can you embed names?
Robin Dunbar was what, a sociologist or
Because
a
anthropologist.
anthropologist, and he looked at
We're going to have to
social.
stop this soon because I haven't had
Yeah.
breakfast yet.
He'll have,
Yeah, sure.
he looked at social groupings among gorillas. Found that they tended to live in groups of a certain size. And then he looked at smaller monkeys, and the smaller monkeys lived in smaller groups. And eventually, looking at a variety of animals and their social groupings, he discovered that the size of their brain was closely correlated to the size of the groups that they lived in. So he looked at people, of course, because we're just primates. And he discovered that there are similar groups.
Yeah.
And for people, there actually are hierarchies of about 6 group sizes. There's the family group, which is a certain number of people that you are intimate with. There is a hunting group who function together to achieve meals. And that tends to be what, 6 to 12 people. And then there is a larger group where you have several hunting groups working together. And the maximum size group is 160,
Yeah.
150.
Yeah.
Which
More or
is
less.
the number of people that you can sustain relationships with. And that's a matter of the capacity of our cranium to keep track of who you can trust, who you can count on for what, who you owe things to, who owe things to you, and so forth.
That's exactly why I
And
played with
if
300
you look
people.
at your academic community, you'll see the same thing. Academic communities where active participants will probably not get past 150 participants
Or 200.
without splitting
Indeed.
to more specialized communities. And the same is true all over. You
True.
split into smaller groups so that the individuals who are members of the group can actually deal with the interactions that are involved in being members of the group.
And then you get the internet.
Well, I don't think that's changed it.
No, it hasn't.
If you look at news groups, there are a certain number of people who are active posters, who contribute the content, who make the judgments, who do the social outing or flaming or whatever. And I suspect if you look at that, that you'll probably find that the active ones are about 150. You might have a lot of followers, a lot
Well,
of
the thing is,
passive participants.
Well, probably we need to talk about that in a different call if you're interested. But I finished my PhD with showing how I can. So I for 6 years long I had a course on agile for managers, right? It's for part of the Solvay Business School. And but the problem is if you do all the modern innovation on education, flipping the classroom, blah blah blah, you become like the teacher becomes a coach again. And then I showed that one coach normally can provide 30 projects, but I showed that one person can supervise 300 projects. So I had a setting where I could actually play with twice the number. I knew I needed more than 150. So that was a setting that I asked the professors that I wanted to prove that it's above the 150 rule. And so, but that's what when you start implementing the cognition into the platform. And I mean, I've heard before, you mentioned how that's happening in Amazon. We know the concept of stigmergy from biology, where you see how ants and other social creatures do the self-organization. But you can use it to design platforms that would incorporate the cognition. And then you have an all new game.
But the same constraints of what the human psyche is capable of. You're not changing people.
You're not changing people. No, no, no. You're not changing people. But you're augmenting their intelligence. We actually had an experiment with 3,000 people in a keynote, and it's so easy to do in a keynote. You just start with saying like, there's a hashtag, and if you want, you can use that hashtag to have a parallel conversation on the flow that's happening with keynote. And if you are with 3,000 people, there are enough smart people in the room to have an interesting flow of thoughts. But those are flows of thoughts that are happening in like superposition of what your own flows of thoughts are. And if you're doing that, at a certain moment, you really have like the feeling that the whole room is connected to your being. And there are many, it's a very strange feeling and experience, but it's kind of, it's like ideas pop in your head that didn't pop in your head, basically. But you can design around that. You can design platforms and structures around that. And the thing that I'm seeing is that it's also happening in the world, but it's not being designed. So it's happening without people knowing it. So we are creating cognitive things without actually knowing that we are doing it. And there's
a complex adaptive system, yeah?
Yeah. But then you get something like a Trump and then you get all the crazy stuff you say today, right? I see it as a direct consequence of the cognition being implemented at a higher level. And that fits our research group on global brain. That's.
Well, I think we need to go. I haven't had even breakfast yet, and it's 1 o'clock. So.
Well, thanks a lot. This was a very interesting discussion. Yeah, I need to cuddle my kids to bed. So.
It's time.
It looks dark.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
We'll see you.
We'll see you. Bye.
Bye.
Ayahuasca.